Move, hands up. Hey, hold on, what are you?
Out of the car.
Out now.
I'm cooperating.
Move.
Gun sack clear.
Step out, step out.
Wait.
Down, face down. Hands behind your back. Do it now.
My badge, look. I'm on your side.
Keep your hands where I can see them.
I'm the chief.
The evening of March 14th, 2019 began like countless others in the city of Riverdale, Ohio. A light drizzle had started to fall around 7 o'clock, coating the streets with a thin layer of moisture that made the asphalt gleam under the amber glow of streetlights. Traffic was sparse on Pemberton Avenue, one of the main arteries cutting through the affluent Westbrook Heights neighborhood. This was the kind of area where manicured lawns stretched behind wrought iron fences, where luxury vehicles sat in circular driveways, and where residents expected a certain level of tranquility from their surroundings. On this particular Thursday evening, a dark blue Lexus LS sedan made its way south along Pemberton Avenue. The vehicle moved at a steady pace, its headlights cutting through the mist. Behind the wheel sat a man who had spent more than 3 decades in law enforcement. A man who had risen through every rank imaginable, who had walked the same streets as a rookie patrol officer before eventually commanding the entire department. His name was Marcus Thompson, and at 51 years old, he served as the chief of police for the Riverdale Police Department. He was also the first African American to hold that position in the department's 92-year history. What happened over the next several minutes would expose a wound that had festered beneath the surface of American policing for generations. It would reveal the gap between policy and practice, between what officers are trained to do and what some choose to do when they believe no one is watching. But someone was watching. A small camera mounted on the chest of a young officer was recording everything, and that recording would change lives, careers, and force an entire community to confront uncomfortable truths about the institution sworn to protect them. If you find yourself drawn to stories that examine the complex intersection of power, accountability, and justice, then stay with me until the end of this one. The details that unfold will challenge assumptions and raise questions that linger long after the final words are spoken. Consider subscribing if you appreciate in-depth examinations of cases like this. Now, let me take you back to the beginning of this extraordinary chain of events. Marcus Thompson had not planned to be driving through Westbrook Heights that evening. His day had started early, as most of his days did, with a 6 o'clock briefing at headquarters downtown. The Riverdale Police Department had been navigating a challenging period. Community tensions were high following a controversial arrest several months earlier, and Thompson had been working tirelessly to rebuild trust between the department and the neighborhoods it served. He had implemented new training protocols, established civilian oversight committees, and perhaps most significantly, he had pushed for the mandatory use of body-worn cameras for all patrol officers. That last initiative had not come without resistance. Some officers viewed the cameras as an intrusion, a sign that the department did not trust its own personnel. Thompson had addressed these concerns directly in department-wide meetings. He stood before rows of uniformed officers and explained that the cameras protected everyone. They protected citizens from potential misconduct, and they protected officers from false accusations. Transparency, he argued, was the foundation of legitimate policing. The cameras were tools of accountability, not weapons of suspicion. By early evening, Thompson had been in and out of meetings for nearly 12 hours. A budget review with city council members had stretched longer than expected, followed by a tense discussion about overtime allocations with the police union representative. His wife, Eleanor, had called around 5:30 to remind him about dinner with their daughter and son-in-law. They were celebrating news of a first grandchild on the way. Thompson had promised to be home by 7 at the latest. He left headquarters around 6:15, still wearing the charcoal gray suit he had put on that morning. His badge and service weapon were locked in his desk drawer. When he was off duty and out of uniform, Marcus Thompson preferred to move through the world like any other citizen. He believed that seeing the community from this perspective helped him understand the experiences of the people his officers encountered every day. Tonight, he was not the chief of police. He was simply a husband and father, heading home to share a meal with his family. The route through Westbrook Heights was slightly longer than his usual commute, but Thompson had chosen it deliberately. He found the quiet streets calming after hectic days. The neighborhood's large oak trees, even bare in early March, created a canopy that felt almost protective. He turned onto Pemberton Avenue and settled into a comfortable speed, his mind already shifting toward the evening ahead. Eleanor had mentioned she was making his favorite, and he found himself looking forward to the simple pleasure of a home-cooked meal. At that same moment, approximately half a mile ahead, a marked Riverdale police cruiser sat idling in the parking lot of a small strip mall. Inside the vehicle, a 23-year-old officer named Derek Vance was finishing the last bites of a sandwich he had picked up from a nearby deli. This was Vance's first night of solo patrol. He had completed his training cycle just 2 weeks earlier, partnered with a senior officer who had signed off on his readiness to work independently. Tonight was supposed to be a milestone, the beginning of his real career in law enforcement. Derek Vance had joined the Riverdale Police Department 8 months prior, fresh from the State Police Academy. He had grown up in a working-class suburb about 40 miles east of Riverdale, the son of a factory worker and a school secretary. Law enforcement had appealed to him since childhood, shaped largely by television shows that portrayed officers as heroes who brought order to chaos. The Academy had reinforced certain aspects of this narrative while adding layers of procedure and protocol. Vance graduated in the middle of his class, showing particular enthusiasm during tactical exercises but receiving lower marks in community relations modules. His field training had been unremarkable. His training officer, a 15-year veteran named Sergeant Rollins, had noted that Vance was eager, perhaps too eager at times, but generally followed instructions. There had been a few instances where Rollins had to counsel the young officer about proportionality, about matching his response to the actual threat level of a situation. Vance had a tendency to escalate encounters that might have been resolved through calm conversation, but these were noted as areas for development, not disqualifying flaws. Every rookie had things to learn. That was the nature of the job. What Vance's personnel file also contained, though given less weight, were 4 civilian complaints filed during his brief tenure. 2 involved allegations of unnecessarily aggressive language during traffic stops. 1 described an encounter where Vance had ordered a teenager off his bicycle and conducted a search without clear justification. The 4th, filed just 3 weeks before this evening, came from an elderly woman who claimed Vance had been dismissive and rude when she reported suspicious activity in her neighborhood. All 4 complaints had been classified as inconclusive due to insufficient evidence, the body camera footage either unavailable or deemed ambiguous. The department's early intervention system, designed to flag officers who might be heading toward serious problems, had not triggered any alerts regarding Derek Vance. The threshold required 5 complaints within a 12-month period. Vance had only 4. He had slipped beneath the radar, his pattern of behavior invisible to the administrative mechanisms meant to identify it. On this Thursday evening, he sat in his patrol car, feeling a mixture of excitement and nervous energy. He was finally on his own, finally able to prove himself without a supervisor looking over his shoulder. The rain had picked up slightly. Vance finished his sandwich, wiped his hands on a paper napkin, and reached for the ignition. He had been stationary for nearly 20 minutes, which felt too long. He wanted to be active, to find something worth responding to. The radio had been quiet, just routine traffic and occasional dispatches to other units across the city. Vance pulled the cruiser out of the parking lot and headed toward Pemberton Avenue. Westbrook Heights was not a high-crime area by any measure, but his training officer had mentioned that it was a good place to conduct traffic enforcement. Plenty of expensive vehicles passed through, and you never knew what you might find. That phrase stuck in Vance's mind as he turned onto the wide, tree-lined street. You never knew what you might find. It contained an assumption that had been subtly reinforced throughout his training. The idea that a patrol officer's job was to uncover wrongdoing that others were trying to hide. Every vehicle was a potential source of discovery. Every driver was potentially concealing something. This mindset, when applied without discretion, could transform routine encounters into adversarial confrontations. Vance drove slowly, scanning the vehicles that passed in the opposite direction. Most were unremarkable sedans and SUVs, their occupants invisible behind rain-speckled windows. Then he noticed the Lexus. It was a newer model, dark blue, its chrome details catching the streetlight. The vehicle was well-maintained, expensive, the kind of car that might belong to a successful professional or business owner. Through the driver's side window, Vance could make out the silhouette of a black man behind the wheel. Something clicked in Derek Vance's mind at that moment, though he would never admit it publicly and might not have even acknowledged it privately. The expensive car, the affluent neighborhood, the black driver. These elements combined to form a picture that did not match his expectations. This was not the kind of driver he expected to see in this kind of vehicle, in this kind of neighborhood, at this time of evening. There was no articulable probable cause, no traffic violation, no evidence of any wrongdoing. But Vance felt a suspicion he could not name, and he chose to act on it. He executed a U-turn and began following the Lexus at a distance of about 50 yards. The body camera mounted on his uniform chest activated automatically as he toggled his emergency lights. In a conference room months later, investigators would review this footage frame by frame, noting every detail, every word, every action. The camera's microphone picked up ambient sounds from inside the cruiser, including the steady thump of Vance's elevated heartbeat transmitted through his equipment vest. Up ahead, Marcus Thompson noticed the flashing lights in his rearview mirror. His first reaction was mild confusion. He had been driving at exactly the posted speed limit. His registration was current, and his vehicle bore no visible defects. He wondered if there might be an emergency somewhere ahead, if the officer was simply trying to pass. Thompson slowed and eased toward the curb to give the cruiser room, but instead of passing, the police vehicle slowed as well, maintaining its position behind him. Thompson's confusion deepened into something more complex. He had been pulled over before, many times over the years, often for reasons that were never adequately explained. These stops had decreased significantly once he rose to senior ranks and became recognizable within the department. But in his civilian clothes, driving an unmarked personal vehicle, he was not the chief of police. He was simply a black man in America, and some experiences transcended rank and title. He pulled the Lexus completely to the curb and put the vehicle in park. The rain continued to fall, droplets streaking down his windows. Thompson took a breath and reached for his wallet, extracting his driver's license. He also removed his department identification, which displayed his name, photograph, and rank in bold letters. He held both items in his left hand, keeping his right hand visible on the steering wheel. These were the precautions he had learned over a lifetime, the choreography of survival that Black Americans often performed during police encounters. In the cruiser behind him, Derek Vance was preparing to approach. He reported the stop over his radio, providing the location and the license plate number. The dispatcher acknowledged the transmission and asked for the reason for the stop. Vance hesitated for a fraction of a second before responding that he was conducting a registration check. It was a flimsy pretext, and he knew it. The Lexus plates were clearly visible and showed no irregularities. But the statement was on record now, and Vance stepped out of his vehicle to continue what he had started. The rain had intensified, and Vance neglected to grab his department-issued rain jacket from the back seat. He approached the driver's side of the Lexus with quick, determined strides. His right hand rested on the grip of his holstered service weapon, a posture that was technically within policy for unknown risk traffic stops, but unnecessary for a routine registration check. His body camera captured everything, its wide-angle lens taking in the wet pavement, the luxury vehicle, and the figure waiting inside. Thompson lowered his window as the officer approached. He could see immediately that this was a young officer, someone he did not recognize. The Riverdale Police Department employed over 400 sworn personnel, and Thompson knew most of them by name, but turnover in recent years meant that newer officers were sometimes strangers to him. He waited for the officer to speak first, adhering to the protocol he always followed during these encounters. Vance reached the window and leaned down slightly, his flashlight beam sweeping across the interior of the vehicle. The light passed over Thompson's face, then moved to the passenger seat, the back seat, the dashboard. The beam lingered on a folder of documents sitting on the passenger seat. Vance's demeanor was already tense, his jaw set, his eyes moving rapidly. He spoke without introducing himself. The words came out clipped and accusatory. He asked Thompson what he was doing in this neighborhood. The question hung in the air between them. It was not a standard inquiry for a traffic stop. It assumed that Thompson's presence required explanation, that he did not belong in Westbrook Heights by default. Thompson felt the familiar weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had answered variations of this question countless times throughout his life, but never while serving as the chief of police. Never while the person asking the question worked for him. Thompson responded calmly. He stated that he lived about 2 miles from this location and was heading home from work. His voice was measured, controlled. He held up the identification cards he had prepared, his driver's license and his department credentials. He told the officer that he was Marcus Thompson, chief of the Riverdale Police Department. Something shifted in Derek Vance's expression, but not in the direction one might expect. Instead of recognition or embarrassment, his face hardened. He had heard claims like this before, or at least believed he had. Suspects sometimes made outlandish statements to avoid accountability. This man, sitting in an expensive car in a wealthy neighborhood, was claiming to be the chief of police. Vance's skepticism overwhelmed any possibility of verification. He decided in that moment that he was being lied to. What happened over the next 90 seconds would destroy Derek Vance's career and send shockwaves through the entire Riverdale community. The body camera captured it all in unflinching detail, recording audio and video that would be played in courtrooms, broadcast on national news, and analyzed by experts in police conduct for years to come. The footage became evidence not just of what one officer did, but of what happens when bias overrides training and suspicion replaces judgment. Take a moment to consider the position Marcus Thompson found himself in. He was a high-ranking law enforcement official, a leader who had dedicated his life to public service, and he was being treated as a criminal suspect on a public street in the community he served. I am curious to hear your thoughts. If you were in his position, how do you think you would have responded? Drop your perspective in the comments below. Vance ordered Thompson to step out of the vehicle. His tone had escalated sharply, moving from suspicious to openly hostile. He repeated the command when Thompson did not immediately comply. Thompson, still holding his identification, asked the officer why he was being ordered out of the car. He had committed no violation. He had provided identification. The situation had no legitimate basis for escalation, but Derek Vance was no longer interested in legitimacy. His mind had constructed a narrative that he was determined to see through. An expensive vehicle, a black driver, an unbelievable story about being the police chief. In Vance's calculation, these elements added up to deception. He reached for the door handle and pulled it open himself when Thompson did not exit quickly enough. Thompson found himself processing two realities simultaneously. The first was personal, visceral. He was being pulled from his own vehicle by an officer who refused to look at his credentials. The humiliation of the moment mixed with genuine concern for his physical safety. The second reality was professional. As police chief, he understood immediately the magnitude of what was occurring. This was a civil rights violation unfolding in real time, and the body camera on the officer's chest was recording every second. He made a decision that would prove crucial. He did not resist. Despite his authority, despite the clear wrongfulness of the officer's actions, Thompson allowed himself to be extracted from the vehicle. He kept his hands visible at all times. He continued to identify himself verbally, repeating his name and title in a steady voice. He understood that resistance, even justified resistance, could escalate the encounter into something deadly. He had seen too many cases where black men guilty of nothing had lost their lives in confrontations with police. He refused to become another statistic. Vance ordered Thompson to place his hands on the hood of the Lexus. The rain was falling steadily now, soaking through Thompson's suit jacket. He complied, spreading his fingers against the wet metal. The indignity of the position was overwhelming. Here was a man who had spent 32 years in law enforcement, who had earned the highest rank in his department, being treated like a common criminal on suspicion of nothing more than driving while black. The identification cards had fallen to the pavement when Vance pulled Thompson from the vehicle. They lay face up on the wet asphalt, the department credentials clearly visible. Thompson asked the officer to look at the ID on the ground. He stated again, clearly and without hostility, that he was the chief of police and that this stop had no legal basis. Vance glanced at the credentials for perhaps half a second. Later, he would claim that he could not read them properly due to the rain. But the body camera footage would show that the laminated cards were clearly legible, the photograph and text visible even in the low light. Vance chose not to examine them. He was committed to his course of action and could not allow contradicting evidence to derail him. He began conducting a pat-down search of Chief Thompson. His hands moved roughly across the older man's torso, checking for weapons. Thompson remained still, though his mind was racing. He thought about his wife, waiting at home with dinner. He thought about his daughter, pregnant with her first child. He thought about the hundreds of officers who served under his command and how this moment would affect their perception of the department they worked for. And underneath all of these thoughts ran a current of anger. tightly controlled but undeniably present. This should not be happening. This should never happen to anyone. The pat-down revealed nothing because there was nothing to reveal. Thompson was an off-duty police chief driving home from work. He carried no contraband, no weapons, no evidence of any crime. Vance should have ended the encounter at this point. He should have examined the identification, verified Thompson's identity, and recognized the catastrophic error he had made. Instead, he escalated further. He asked Thompson where he had gotten the car. The implication was unmistakable. Vance was suggesting that Thompson, a black man, could not legitimately own such an expensive vehicle. The question was not part of any protocol for traffic stops. It served no investigative purpose. It was pure bias, verbalized and recorded. Thompson responded that the vehicle was his, purchased and paid for with his own money. His voice remained level, though the effort to maintain that composure was becoming increasingly difficult. He asked Vance once again to look at the department identification on the ground. He told the officer that he was making a serious mistake. Vance interpreted this warning as a threat. The body camera captured his response. He told Thompson that he did not take kindly to being threatened. He said that people like Thompson thought they could talk their way out of anything. The phrase "people like Thompson" echoed in the recording, its meaning clear to anyone who would later hear it. Vance was not seeing an individual. He was seeing a category, a type, a collection of assumptions that had nothing to do with the actual man standing before him. What happened next elevated the encounter from a wrongful stop to an outright assault. Vance grabbed Thompson's arm and twisted it behind his back. The movement was sudden and violent, executed with the kind of force reserved for resisting suspects. Thompson's shoulder wrenched painfully. He let out an involuntary sound of pain but did not pull away. He continued to verbally identify himself, even as Vance pushed him harder against the hood of the car. Then Vance swept Thompson's leg, sending him to the ground. The older man landed hard on the wet pavement, his suit now soaked and dirty. Vance was on top of him immediately, pinning him down with a knee to the back. Thompson's face was pressed against the asphalt, rainwater pooling near his mouth and nose. The pain in his shoulder intensified. He could feel the weight of the young officer pressing down on him, and he thought, with terrible clarity, that this was how it felt. This was what citizens experienced when encounters went wrong. This was the fear and helplessness that he had tried to address through policy and training, made suddenly, brutally real. The body camera recorded Thompson's voice, muffled but audible, still identifying himself. He said his name. He said his rank. He told Vance to call dispatch and verify his identity. He told him to look at the badge on the ground. Throughout the assault, he never stopped trying to communicate, never stopped attempting to penetrate the wall of Vance's assumptions. Vance produced his handcuffs and began securing Thompson's wrists. The metal bit into skin cold and tight. Thompson felt the finality of the click as each cuff locked into place. He was now restrained, lying on a public street in the rain, being treated as a criminal by one of his own officers. The surreal quality of the moment threatened to overwhelm him. This could not be happening, and yet it was. At precisely that moment, the situation shifted with the arrival of a second patrol unit. Sergeant Diana Fuentes had heard Vance's traffic stop broadcast and decided to swing by as an informal backup. She was a 16-year veteran of the department, a supervisor who had worked closely with Chief Thompson on numerous initiatives. As her cruiser pulled up behind the scene, her headlights illuminated what looked like a standard arrest in progress. An officer had a suspect on the ground, handcuffed and secured. Then she recognized the Lexus. She had seen that vehicle in the headquarters parking garage countless times. Her gaze moved to the figure on the ground, and recognition hit her like a physical blow. She saw the gray suit, now soaked and dirty. She saw the face of the man pinned to the pavement. It was Chief Thompson, her commanding officer, the head of the entire department. Sergeant Fuentes' body camera captured her reaction. A sharp intake of breath. A muttered exclamation of disbelief, then rapid movement as she exited her vehicle and approached the scene. Her voice, when she spoke, carried an edge of barely controlled urgency. She asked Vance what he was doing. She told him to let the man up. She identified Thompson by name and rank, her words falling into the rain-soaked air like stones. Derek Vance froze. For the first time since the encounter began, his certainty wavered. He looked down at the man beneath him, then at the approaching sergeant, then at the identification still lying on the ground where it had fallen. The reality of his situation began to dawn on him, though its full magnitude would take much longer to comprehend. Fuentes repeated her order. She told Vance to remove the handcuffs and help Chief Thompson to his feet. Her tone left no room for discussion. Vance complied mechanically, his movements suddenly uncertain. He unlocked the cuffs and stepped back, watching as Sergeant Fuentes helped Thompson rise from the ground. Thompson stood slowly, pain radiating through his shoulder and back. His suit was ruined, his dignity violated, but his composure remained intact. He looked at Derek Vance for a long moment, studying the young officer's face. What he saw there was fear, finally, and the beginning of understanding. But he also saw something else, something that would stay with him throughout the ordeal ahead. He saw a complete absence of remorse. Vance was afraid of the consequences he now faced. He was not sorry for what he had done. Fuentes was already on her radio, calling for a supervisor and requesting that command staff be notified of an incident involving the chief. The professional machinery of the department was beginning to turn, a process that would accelerate rapidly in the hours and days ahead. But in that moment, standing in the rain on Pemberton Avenue, the full implications had not yet become clear. Thompson asked Sergeant Fuentes to secure the scene and preserve all evidence, including the body camera footage from both officers present. His voice was quiet, but firm. Even in his disheveled state, even after what he had just endured, he was thinking like a police chief. He understood that what happened in the next few hours would determine whether this incident became a catalyst for accountability or was swept into the shadows. He retrieved his identification from the ground, brushing away the water and grit. The laminated card bearing his photograph and rank seemed almost to mock the situation. All of this could have been avoided if Vance had simply looked at what was offered to him. But Vance had not wanted to look. He had wanted to confirm his suspicions, and he had found what he was looking for regardless of the evidence. Within 20 minutes, the scene on Pemberton Avenue had transformed into a command post. 2 additional sergeants arrived, followed by a lieutenant and the department's internal affairs commander. An ambulance was dispatched to assess Thompson's injuries, though he initially declined medical attention. News of the incident spread through the department's ranks with remarkable speed, passed through unofficial channels that moved faster than any official notification system. Derek Vance was relieved of his duties pending investigation. His service weapon was collected, his badge confiscated. He was driven to headquarters for an initial statement, though he was advised of his right to union representation before answering any questions. The young officer who had started the evening with dreams of proving himself now faced the prospect of losing everything he had worked for. Thompson finally agreed to be transported to a local emergency room for evaluation. X-rays revealed a strained rotator cuff and significant bruising along his shoulder and hip. The injuries were not life-threatening, but they were painful evidence of the force that had been used against him. As he sat on the examination table, still wearing his damp and dirty suit, Thompson thought about the body camera footage that was being preserved at that very moment. He thought about the clarity it would provide, and he thought with grim satisfaction about the undeniability of what it had captured. The video became available to internal affairs investigators within 2 hours of the incident. They watched it in a conference room at headquarters. A group of senior officers assembled in stunned silence. The footage ran for just over 9 minutes, documenting everything from the initial U-turn to the arrival of Sergeant Fuentes. It was comprehensive, unambiguous, and damning. The lead investigator, a captain with 24 years on the force, later described his reaction in a deposition. He said he had seen a lot of troubling things in his career. He had investigated corruption, excessive force, even an officer-involved shooting that had divided the community. But he had never seen anything quite like this. The footage showed an officer who had been completely wrong at every stage of the encounter. Wrong to initiate the stop, wrong to ignore identification, wrong to escalate, wrong to use force, and wrong, fundamentally wrong, in the assumptions that had driven his actions from the very beginning. The investigation proceeded on multiple tracks simultaneously. Internal Affairs handled the administrative review that would determine Vance's employment status. The county prosecutor's office began a criminal investigation into potential assault and civil rights violations. The city's Human Resources Department launched a separate inquiry into the department's hiring and training practices, and the media, once they learned of the incident, descended on Riverdale with the intensity of a full-scale siege. The story broke 2 days after the traffic stop when a local television reporter received a tip from an anonymous source within the department. The initial coverage was explosive. A black police chief assaulted by one of his own white officers during a traffic stop. The irony was almost too perfect. Thompson, who had championed body cameras as tools of accountability, had become the beneficiary of that very policy. The cameras he had fought to implement were now providing irrefutable evidence of what had been done to him. National media picked up the story within hours. Cable news networks ran segments featuring legal analysts, civil rights advocates, and former law enforcement officials offering commentary on the footage. Social media amplified the coverage, with the clip from Vance's body camera shared millions of times across platforms. The video became a focal point for conversations about racial profiling, implicit bias, and the disconnect between police reform rhetoric and on-the-ground reality. I want to pause here and acknowledge something important. Stories like this often generate strong reactions, and rightfully so. If you are watching this video because you care about issues of justice and accountability, you are part of a community that believes these conversations matter. Consider sharing this video with others who might benefit from understanding what happened in Riverdale. And if you have not already subscribed to this channel, doing so helps ensure that stories like this continue to receive the attention they deserve. The public response to the Riverdale incident divided along predictable lines, though not entirely. Some defenders of law enforcement attempted to minimize Vance's actions or suggest that there must be more to the story. But the body camera footage made such defenses difficult to maintain. The video showed what it showed. There was no ambiguity to exploit, no conflicting accounts to choose between. Vance had stopped a man without cause, ignored his identification, and assaulted him. The man happened to be the chief of police. But as Thompson himself would later emphasize, the identity of the victim should not determine whether such behavior is unacceptable. Within the Riverdale Police Department, the incident created a profound sense of crisis. Officers who had served under Thompson expressed shock and anger that one of their colleagues had treated their chief in such a manner. Some younger officers, however, privately questioned whether the response would have been as swift if the victim had been an ordinary citizen rather than a high-ranking official. This uncomfortable question would become a central theme in the reforms that eventually followed. Derek Vance, through his union representative and later through private counsel, initially attempted to frame his actions as a reasonable response to a suspicious situation. He maintained that Thompson had been uncooperative and that the identification presented was not clearly visible. But these claims collapsed under the weight of the video evidence. The footage showed Thompson's repeated calm identification of himself. It showed the credentials lying on the ground, clearly legible. It showed Vance actively choosing not to verify the information being offered. The administrative investigation concluded in 17 days. The findings were unambiguous. Vance had violated multiple department policies, including those governing traffic stops, use of force, and professional conduct. More significantly, the investigation found that Vance had demonstrated a pattern of behavior consistent with racial profiling, a practice the department had officially prohibited but evidently failed to prevent. The recommendation was immediate termination. The police commission accepted the recommendation without dissent. Derek Vance was officially dismissed from the Riverdale Police Department on April 4, 2019, less than 3 weeks after the incident. He left headquarters through a side entrance, avoiding the cameras that had gathered at the main doors. His career in law enforcement, 8 months old, was over, but termination was only the beginning of the consequences Vance would face. The county prosecutor, after reviewing the evidence, filed criminal charges including assault in the second degree and violation of civil rights under state law. Federal investigators from the Department of Justice opened their own inquiry into potential federal civil rights violations. The case had become too prominent, too clearly documented for jurisdictional caution. The criminal trial took place the following spring in a courtroom filled with reporters and spectators. The prosecution presented the body camera footage as its centerpiece, playing it for the jury multiple times during the proceedings. They called expert witnesses who testified about proper police procedure, about the training Vance had received, and about how thoroughly he had deviated from established standards. Chief Thompson took the stand on the third day of trial. He recounted the events of that evening in his characteristically measured tone, walking the jury through each moment of the encounter. when asked about his thoughts as he lay on the wet pavement, handcuffed and face down. He paused before answering. He said that he had hoped the body camera was functioning properly. He said that he understood in that moment that without video evidence, no one would believe him. A black man claiming to be the police chief, stopped and assaulted by a white officer. It would sound like an implausible story, an exaggeration, a lie. The camera made denial impossible. The defense attempted to argue that Vance had acted in good faith, that his training had been insufficient, that the department bore responsibility for putting an inexperienced officer on solo patrol. These arguments had some merit as explanations, but they did not constitute legal defenses for the specific charges. The jury deliberated for less than 8 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. At sentencing, the judge addressed Vance directly. He spoke about the sacred trust placed in law enforcement officers and about how thoroughly Vance had betrayed that trust. He noted that the victim's identity, while not relevant to the legal analysis, highlighted the arbitrary nature of Vance's suspicion. The defendant had not known he was stopping the chief of police. He had simply seen a black man in an expensive car and decided that warranted investigation. That impulse, the judge said, was precisely what civil rights laws were designed to prevent. Derek Vance was sentenced to 22 months in federal custody, followed by 3 years of supervised release. He was barred from ever again serving in law enforcement. The sentence was longer than the federal guidelines might have suggested, a reflection of the egregious nature of the conduct and its impact on public confidence in policing. The civil litigation followed a parallel track. Thompson filed a lawsuit against Vance personally and against the city of Riverdale, alleging violations of his constitutional rights and seeking compensatory and punitive damages. The case attracted considerable attention from civil rights organizations, several of which filed amicus briefs supporting Thompson's claims. The city initially attempted to defend itself, arguing that Vance's actions were aberrational and that the department's policies were sound. But the evidence gathered during discovery complicated this narrative. Internal documents revealed that Vance had accumulated 4 civilian complaints in his short tenure, none of which had triggered any formal intervention. Training records showed that Vance had received low marks in de-escalation techniques, but had still been cleared for solo patrol. The department's early warning system, designed to identify problematic officers before serious incidents occurred, had completely failed to flag Vance. Settlement negotiations began after these documents became public. The city faced the prospect of a lengthy trial, additional damaging revelations, and potentially massive liability. After several weeks of discussions, a settlement was reached. The terms included a payment of $35 million, divided between compensatory damages for Thompson's injuries and punitive damages intended to deter similar conduct. It also included a commitment by the city to implement a comprehensive reform program overseen by an independent monitor. The settlement was announced at a press conference attended by city officials, Thompson's legal team, and a crowd of reporters that spilled out of the room. Thompson made a brief statement in which he emphasized that the case was never about him personally. The settlement, he said, should not have been necessary. No amount of money could undo what had happened on Pemberton Avenue, but the reforms that would follow might prevent similar incidents from destroying other lives. The federal consent decree that resulted from the case became a model for police reform efforts nationally. It required the Riverdale Police Department to revise its training protocols, placing greater emphasis on implicit bias recognition and de-escalation techniques. It mandated changes to the early warning system, lowering the threshold for intervention and requiring supervisors to take meaningful action when patterns of concerning behavior emerged. It established enhanced procedures for reviewing body camera footage and investigating civilian complaints. And it created an independent oversight board with genuine authority to review departmental policies and discipline recommendations. The implementation of these reforms was neither quick nor painless. Some officers resisted what they viewed as external interference in departmental operations. The police union filed grievances challenging several provisions of the consent decree. Community activists, meanwhile, criticized the pace of change as too slow and the reforms as insufficient. Progress came in increments marked by periodic assessments from the federal monitor appointed to oversee compliance. Marcus Thompson remained as chief of police throughout this period, despite occasional calls for his resignation from those who blamed him for the negative attention the department had received. He viewed his continued service as essential to ensuring that the reforms took root. Under his leadership, the department hired a new training director with expertise in bias prevention to leave behind. He spoke about the progress the department had made and the challenges that remained. He acknowledged that one case, even one as significant as his own, could not resolve the deeply rooted issues that plagued American policing. But he expressed hope that the reforms implemented in Riverdale could serve as a template for other departments willing to examine themselves honestly. He announced that he was establishing a foundation dedicated to promoting police accountability and transparency nationwide. The Thompson Foundation for Public Safety Reform would provide resources to communities seeking to implement oversight mechanisms and would advocate for policy changes at the state and federal level. It was, he said, a way to transform a painful personal experience into something that might benefit others. The foundation has since become a significant voice in the national conversation about policing. It has provided support to civilian oversight boards in numerous cities, funded research into effective reform strategies, and organized training programs for community activists seeking to engage constructively with local law enforcement. Thompson serves as its chairman, his experience lending credibility to its mission. Derek Vance served his full sentence and was released in early 2021. His attempts to rebuild his life have been hampered by the notoriety of his case. The video of the Riverdale incident remains accessible online, a permanent record that follows him into job interviews and personal relationships. In a rare interview given to a local journalist 2 years after his release, he expressed what might be interpreted as regret, though his words stopped short of full accountability. He said he wished things had gone differently, that he never intended to harm anyone. He blamed his training, his inexperience, the pressures of the job. What he did not say, and what many observers noted, was that he was sorry for the specific harm he had caused to Marcus Thompson or for the bias that had driven his actions. The Riverdale case continues to be studied in police academies and law schools across the country. It has become a standard example in training modules about implicit bias, the importance of de-escalation, and the value of body-worn cameras. Instructors use the footage to illustrate how quickly encounters can escalate when officers act on assumptions rather than evidence, and how completely those escalations can be documented when cameras are present. What makes this case particularly instructive is its ironic symmetry. The victim was the very official who had pushed for the cameras that recorded his assault. The department whose failures were exposed was the same department that had implemented reforms intended to prevent such failures. The system worked, in a sense, but only after it had first catastrophically failed. The cameras did not prevent the misconduct. They merely ensured that the misconduct could not be denied. This raises uncomfortable questions about the limits of technological solutions to problems rooted in human behavior. Body cameras can document what officers do, but they cannot change what officers believe. They can provide evidence for prosecutions after the fact, but they cannot stop a biased officer from making biased decisions in the moment. The real work of reform must happen before officers put on their uniforms, in the hiring process, in training, in the cultural expectations communicated by supervisors and peers. The story of Marcus Thompson and Derek Vance is, in many ways, a story about the gap between policy and practice. Riverdale had policies against racial profiling. It had training programs addressing implicit bias. It had body cameras intended to promote accountability. And yet a young officer, 8 months into his career, felt comfortable initiating a baseless stop, ignoring clear identification, and physically assaulting a citizen based on nothing more than the color of his skin and the car he was driving. The policies existed, but they had not reached Derek Vance in any meaningful way. How we close that gap is perhaps the central challenge of police reform in America. It requires not just new policies, but new cultures, new norms, new ways of understanding what policing is for and whom it serves. It requires officers to see the people they encounter as individuals deserving of respect, not as categories requiring suspicion. It requires departments to take warning signs seriously, to intervene before 4 complaints become 5, before a problematic rookie becomes a dangerous veteran. and it requires all of us as citizens to remain engaged with these issues, even when they are not dominating the headlines. The work of reform is slow and unglamorous. It happens in city council meetings and training academies, in budget negotiations and community forums. It requires sustained attention and persistent pressure. It requires the belief that change is possible, even when progress seems painfully slow. As you reach the end of this story, I invite you to consider what role you might play in these ongoing efforts. Whether you are a member of law enforcement, a community activist, or simply a citizen who cares about justice, your voice and your actions matter. What happened in Riverdale should not have required a victim who happened to be the chief of police to receive attention. The same injustice, when inflicted on ordinary citizens, too often goes unrecognized and unaddressed. If this story has affected you, if it has made you think differently about policing, accountability, or the persistence of bias in our institutions, I encourage you to share it with others. Conversations like these are how change begins. And if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, please consider doing so. Together, we can continue to examine the stories that shape our understanding of justice and our commitment to building a more equitable society. The legacy of the Riverdale incident is still being written. In the department that Marcus Thompson led for so many years, officers now undergo regular training on bias recognition and de-escalation. They learn about the case, studying the body camera footage as an example of what not to do. Some of them, particularly the younger ones, find it hard to believe that such a thing could happen, that an officer could make so many wrong choices in such a short time. But those who have been in law enforcement longer know better. They know how easy it is in the heat of the moment to let assumptions override evidence. They know how quickly encounters can spiral out of control. The cameras are still there, mounted on every officer's uniform. They record every stop, every interaction, every moment when the power of the badge meets the vulnerability of the citizen. Most of what they capture is routine, unremarkable, the ordinary business of keeping the peace. But every officer knows that any encounter could be the one that matters, the one that will be scrutinized and judged, the one that will define their career. In that knowledge, perhaps, lies the beginning of accountability. The cameras are not just recording devices. They are witnesses, silent observers that remember everything. They create the possibility of truth in situations where truth has too often been contested. They do not solve the problems of policing, but they make those problems visible. And visibility, as Marcus Thompson understood when he first advocated for their adoption, is the necessary precondition for change. The night of March 14, 2019, Marcus Thompson was driving home to have dinner with his family. A simple thing, an ordinary errand. And yet it became something else entirely, a confrontation with forces that have shaped American society since its founding. He survived that night. He pursued justice through every available channel. He used his position to advocate for reforms that might protect others from similar experiences. But he was clear-eyed about the limitations of what he had accomplished. At a speaking engagement several years after his retirement, someone asked him whether he believed the problem of racial bias in policing could ever be fully solved. He thought for a moment before answering. He said that the work would never be finished, that each generation would have to fight the battles of its time. But he also said that progress was possible, that the arc of history, while long, did bend toward justice. The question was whether we would do the work required to bend it further. That question remains open. It is a question for policymakers and police chiefs, for training officers and rookie cops, for judges and juries, for citizens and communities. It is a question that each of us answers through our choices and our actions. What happened in Riverdale was a failure, but it was also eventually an opportunity. The opportunity to learn, to change, to do better. Marcus Thompson took that opportunity and made something meaningful from it. Derek Vance, by his choices, became a cautionary example studied in academies across the country. The city of Riverdale, forced to confront its shortcomings, emerged with stronger institutions and clearer commitments. And the body camera, that small device clipped to an officer's uniform, proved once again that accountability requires evidence, and that evidence requires the courage to look at it honestly. The rain eventually stopped that night on Pemberton Avenue. The streets dried, the normal rhythms of life resumed. But something had changed, something that could not be undone. A record existed, a truth preserved in digital footage, a story that could be told and retold without distortion. In a world where power often operates in shadows, that transparency was itself a kind of justice. This is what happened in Riverdale. This is what one traffic stop revealed about an entire system. And this is why stories like this matter, why they deserve to be told and heard and remembered. Not because they provide easy answers, but because they illuminate the questions we must keep asking if we are to build the just society we claim to want. Thank you for staying with me through this entire account. If it has prompted reflection, sparked conversation, or deepened your understanding of these vital issues, then it has served its purpose. Share your thoughts in the comments. Share this video with others who might benefit from it, and continue to engage with the difficult, necessary work of building a more accountable future. Until next time.